To build our PBR shader, I'm going to start out with a new material and a diffuse shader. The diffuse is going to approximate the light that gets absorbed slightly and then bounces right back out. It's a good base for our non-metal materials, so we just need to add reflection. So let's add in a glossy shader with Shift-A, Shader, and Glossy. Now, before we mix the two together, take a look at what happens when we increase the roughness. Suddenly, it gets a lot darker and is losing too much light to conform to the law of conservation. Remember when we talked about roughness simulating lots of tiny bumps on the surface? Well, in this shader, if the light hits one of those bumps and bounces out of view, it's considered dead. But in reality, some of those, of course, will get absorbed, but a lot of them should be bouncing right back out. To fix this, there's a new type called the CGX Multiscatter that takes this into account. So if you just have this left to Beckman or CGX, then the roughness is going to be incorrect. However, with the new multiscatter, things work just right. Now let's mix the two together with a mix shader. Shift-A, Shader, and Mix. We can plug both of these in, and we're pretty set to go, except we just need to add Fresnel. Blender already has a node for that. We can just add it in with Shift-A, Input, and Fresnel, and we can plug this into the mix factor. Now we're getting those glossy highlights just around the edges like we should, but we do have one problem in that it doesn't take the roughness of the glossy into account. The more rough something is, the more surface area facing us we're going to get, so it makes sense that there should be less Fresnel. Cycles uses the normals of the object to tell which way the faces are pointing, so we just need to tell Cycles that as we increase the roughness, the more normals are pointing directly at us. Let's add a geometry node. Shift-A, Input, and Geometry. This node has all the info on where the faces are and which way they are pointing. This normal value right here is what Cycles is already using just in the background, so we don't have to plug it in every time. So if we plug this in, we shouldn't see any difference at all. This incoming value down here, however, is exactly what we need when things are completely rough, because it's saying that every face is now pointing right at the camera. If we enable the Node Wrangler add-on, I'll just bring up the user preferences with Control-Alt-U and type in Node. I'll just make sure you have that checked. And that way, if you hold down Control-Shift and continue clicking on these, it'll just move down the list. So the incoming is just a pure blue, meaning that all of those faces are pointing directly at us. So as we increase the roughness of the glossy, we need to mix between the normal and incoming values. So we can do that pretty easily with Shift-A and Color Mix RGB. Plug in the normal for the top value and incoming for color number 2. And as long as this factor up here and the roughness value of the glossy are exactly the same number, then things are behaving exactly as they should. So in order to get those numbers the same all of the time, let's control them all with one value. We can do that with Shift-A, Input, and Value, and just take this and plug this into both the factor and the roughness. So with that, let's decrease the value of the diffuse just so we can see this a little bit more clearly. Maybe zoom in. I'm using Shift-B to create a smaller render area so it renders a bit faster. And now as we have a really low roughness, then we're getting a lot of that Fresnel effect. And as we increase the roughness, then we're getting less and less of that Fresnel effect, which is exactly what we want. So with that, we're done with the non-metallic portion of this, and now we just need to make sure that this also works for metals. Metals are different from non-metals in that they don't have any diffuse component, and their highlights are tinted. So let's add in those two factors one at a time. The first thing we should do is just duplicate this value node over here, and the second one will act as our metalness. Just so that we don't get confused when we have these two hanging out together, I'm going to go over to this Node Properties panel, which you can open if you just press N, and I'll change the label to metalness. Then for this first node up here, I'll change this to roughness. So with this metalness value, we need to mix between the diffuse and the glossy. So as something is completely metal, then the shader should be completely glossy. So let's press Shift-A and add a Color and Mix RGB. Plug that right into the Fresnel. So when the metalness is 0, then this Fresnel will act as normal. However, when it's 1, then the color coming out of this should be completely white, because it should be mixing the glossy 100%. So if we take a look at our shader, we can see that when the metalness is set to 1, of course we should set the roughness down so we can see it a bit better, then it should be completely glossy. But if the metalness is set to 0, then it should also have that diffuse component underneath, so things are working great. Next up, we also need to use this metalness value to control how much these glossy highlights are tinted. So let's also use a mix color node. Let me just move some of these to the left just to make sure we have enough room. I'll select this mix node and press Shift D to duplicate it and plug that right into the glossy. And then I'll use the metalness again to plug right into the factor. So as the metalness is 0, then we should have a completely white highlight. And then as the metalness is 1, it should be, some other color. So let's try this out. If we turn the metalness to 1, you can see that maybe set this to like a gold color or something like that. That's looking good. And then as the metalness is 0, then we are no longer getting those tinted highlights. Now it's much easier to use if the color for the metal and the non-metal is exactly the same for this diffuse and this second color. So let's control those both with one value by going to Shift A, Input, and RGB. So I'll set this to a little bit oranger color so we can see exactly what's going on. And I'll plug that both into the diffuse and into the second color of the mix node down here. So now as we switch between metal and non-metal, we're using the same color, but we're affecting the material in a way that's more appropriate. The very last thing we need to do is make sure that we have our Fresnel affecting our metal shader as well. Because when we have this set to 1, of course everything is already completely glossy, so we can't make it any more glossy. However, it should be reflecting more colors of light as it reaches those edges, so the edges should be less saturated than the faces that are pointing directly at us. So we just need to incorporate this Fresnel value into this mix node here. So let me shift these around a bit. Alright, so let's duplicate this mix shader here with Shift D and plug it in right over the RGB that's going into the metal mix node. And if we press Control Shift click on this mix node, we can see the output of it. And we just need to plug in the Fresnel right in there. Alright, so now that we have that plugged in, you can see that the color is getting less saturated around the edges. So if you press M, you can mute the node and see what it looks like without and what it looks like with. So now let's take a look at the final mix shader, and we can see that there's a subtle but very nice difference between the two when we toggle this off and when we toggle it back on. So it's looking much, much better. So one property of metals is that they actually can change their edge tint based on the wavelengths of light that they reflect. However, I'm not really going to be going into that because for all practical purposes, it makes very little difference, and we can't actually simulate that very well in Blender because in order to do so, we need to use what's called the extinction coefficient and multiply it by imaginary numbers, and I'm not entirely sure how to plug imaginary numbers into a node. So we're just going to call this color white for now, but if you want to change it to something else for artistic purposes, like a nice blue or something, to give it an interesting effect, definitely feel free to do that. So with that, we have our shader completely set up. In the next video, we're going to group this all together into one handy group node so that you can use it in all of your projects without having to set it up every time.